Hello, everyone. This week's podcast is a repeat from October of last year, 2021. And I'm posting it as my holiday gift to all of you to help stay healthy during the holiday season that's already underway. The podcast was with Robert Davis, Ph.D., also known as the Healthy Skeptic. And we talked about his book, Supersized Lies, which is about the weight loss myths keeping many people fat, no matter what they do, and the truth of what really works to be healthy and at a good weight for you. So I hope that you find it interesting, that you find it helpful during this season, and that you have a wonderful holiday. And I'll be back one more time before we actually hit Christmas. So with that being said, I will say goodbye and on to the podcast. Hello, everyone. This is your host, Susan Rosen. And I have a guest today who I'm really excited to have on the podcast. His name is Robert J. Davis, and he is also known as the Healthy Skeptic. And he is an award-winning health journalist whose work has appeared on CNN, PBS, WebMD, and in the Wall Street Journal. Very impressive. The author of 4 books on health, he hosts the Healthy Skeptic video series, which dissects the science behind popular health claims. And Robert Davis holds an undergraduate degree from Princeton University, a master's degree in public health from Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health, and a Ph.D. in health policy from Brandeis University. All very impressive schools. I am very impressed. His new book, which we're going to talk about today, is titled Supersized Lies: How Myths About Weight Loss Are Keeping Us Fat and the Truth About What Really Works. So, Robert, welcome. And very excited to hear about what works.
Thank you, Susan. Well, it's great to be with you.
So tell me what led you up to writing this book, and what did you learn from it as well?
Well, as you referred to in the introduction, I've been a health journalist for many years, and so I've reported through the years on all kinds of health-related issues. I also have a personal passion when it comes to health and wellness, nutrition, exercise, try to practice what I preach. And so I also have an academic background, as you noted, in public health. So in my work, I've tried to combine my academic background, looking at the science. So we have all kinds of claims about so many health issues. Certainly that's come to the fore more so than ever with COVID, with all kinds of conflicting, contradictory, incorrect information. So what I've tried to do with my background in public health and epidemiology is to look at the science, actually look at the studies, and help readers and viewers understand what the science actually says as opposed to what the claims say. So that's some issues. And certainly through the years, I've reported a lot on weight and obesity related issues. And I am inundated, as all journalists are, with all kinds of press releases of people making all kinds of claims. And so I've tried to employ the skills that I have to look at the science behind those and try to set the record straight for the audience. And so in this book, that's what I've tried to do, focusing just on weight loss and obesity, going through a lot of the most common claims, helping people understand what's true, what's not, what's half true, so they can make better decisions for themselves. So as I see it, I'm not here to tell people what to do. I'm not setting out, one size fits all diet plan. But what I am trying to do is to set out the truth about what we know from scientific studies, laying out principles so that people can make better decisions for themselves.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially because unless you do that, people don't really take it in and make it a part of their life.
Right.
It'll just be another fad.
Right. And I think that's an important point, because people have to take it in and then figure out what works for them. That is such a key. Sometimes we look to somebody to tell us, what should I do? Do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And these, as I say, one size fits all diets. And that's a big problem because everybody's different. Not only are our bodies different, but our preferences are different. Our lifestyles are different. So I think that's important to take the information and figure out how to apply that information in a way that's going to work for you.
Yeah. 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 And maybe as we talk a little bit too, excuse me, we can talk, and we don't have to do it right this minute, but also about how, as we age, things change, right? Our bodies we don't burn calories in exactly the same way or as quickly, or, all of that as when we're younger. I don't know whether it's just because we're more active when we're younger, or, what the...
Well, that's true. And then also hormone levels change. For example, as women go through menopause, estrogen levels drop, and that affects the accumulation of body fat, especially around the abdomen. So there are physiological changes that happen. And so what's important there is that people have to change their expectations about what's realistic. It's not to say they can't have a healthy weight and they can't feel good about themselves and how they look, but it is to say that what's realistic to expect of yourself when you're 65 or 70 is different than when you're 20.
Yeah.
And so that's important for people to be aware of.
Or the way that some of these books, these fad books that are out there, the way they talk about food and health and all these kinds of things, a lot of times they don't talk about the differences in age.
That's absolutely right. And that's a crucial distinction that needs to be considered as people are looking at this information.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I do have to point out, because I just did a podcast actually on it, it's not up yet, but that men go through their own version of menopause called andropause.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with men, and there drops in testosterone, and that has similar effects with regard to the deposit of body fat. And so, yes, absolutely. And so it's not just women who are affected; men are affected as well, certainly.
Yeah. I just had to point it out because there are not many people who realize that. So it's always our fault.
Men are just as affected.
So, okay, well, why don't we take a step kind of back and talk a little bit about some of these different diets. We don't have to get specific because we don't need to get lawsuits or anything about it, but about some of the diets over the past, I don't know, couple of decades, because there have been a lot of them that are, do this, do that, you'll lose 20 pounds in 5 days. And it's like, I don't think so.
Right. And one of the things I try to trace is the history of some of these ideas, particularly diets that restrict certain foods or categories of foods. I have a whole chapter called Pick Your Villain. And I trace the history of this starting in the 1970s with the idea that fat is bad. And we all remember that, all of us who are old enough, that fat is the enemy. And so you eat fat, you get fat. And you remember all the foods, the fat-free foods, Snackwell's cookies and all the rest, that if you eat these foods, you can manage your weight. And so people latched onto that idea during the 1970s and 80s. And what do you know? Not only did it not work, the problem got worse. Actually, people got fatter, and we ended up with an epidemic of diabetes. Now, experts debate the reasons for that, but we just know that it was a failure, that strategy did not work. So then we get to the next era, which is I call the Atkins era. That is fats are not the enemy, carbs are the enemy. So Dr. Robert Atkins, who'd been around for a long time, said, if this diet that you're following, this low-fat diet's not working. So instead of cutting out the fats, it's fine to eat fat. Don't eat bread. Don't eat potatoes. Don't eat starchy foods. And that's the solution to weight control. And so what we found out, though, is when studies were done, head-to-head comparisons of a low-fat versus a low-carb diet, what study after study after study has shown that after a year or so, it doesn't matter. They result in the same amount of weight loss, and that over time, people start to regain the weight. Sometimes a low-carb diet may have a slight advantage in the short term over a few months, but over the long term, which is what really matters, there's no difference really. But yet we continue to have, and now we have later versions of this. It's whether it's the keto diet, or whether there are fasting diets, or diets that eliminate gluten, or diets that are detox diets. The list goes on and on. But trying to say there's some kind of villain or particular behavior that people are engaging in, and if you just eliminate that food or that category of food, then that's the secret to losing weight. And so what we know is that it's just not that simple. Mm-hmm. That weight management is far more complex than a specific food or categories of food. And yet this idea continues to be very powerful. And certainly the food industry benefits from this because they continue to crank out all kinds of foods that are free of whatever the villain is. So the foods that are fat-free, the foods that are carb-free, the foods that are sugar-free. And what do they do instead? They put in artificial sweeteners, and we can talk about this more, but those aren't necessarily weight-friendly, and they actually can, foods that are sugar-free can contribute to weight gain as well, paradoxically. So the point is that that this idea of these diets that focus on specific villains have been shown again and again not necessarily to be any better than any other way of eating when it comes to weight. In some cases are actually harmful because they can actually remove foods in our diets that we need. A keto diet, for example, it doesn't have whole grains, which are important for fiber. Doesn't have other nutrients. Certain fruits, or many fruits, are not allowed. Certain vegetables aren't allowed. So that when you start restricting whole categories of foods, you can have nutrient deficiencies. And so the point here, I guess the bottom line is, any diet's going to work short term to help you lose weight. Pretty much any diet will, because it'll reduce calories and reduce the amount you eat. The question is it sustainable? Is it healthy? Is it something that's going to be beneficial both in terms of your weight and your health over the long term? And I like to think the problem with diets is, by definition, they're short term for most people, because in most cases they're not sustainable. So I think the important thing is to sort of focus away from all these diets and to look at overall eating patterns. That's the solution. How you eat overall, the overall quality and composition of your diet, and focus on that as a long-term strategy that's sustainable.
Yeah. Oh, no, I totally agree. And that makes so much sense. I think the other thing too is some people have issues. I mean, they have actual physical problems, right? And then they try and go on one of these other diets, and all it does is exacerbate that.
No question.
Right.
And those problems they can be any number of problems, including people that are prone to eating disorders. And so one of the other things that's very troubling about certain diets is that they exacerbate an unhealthy relationship with food. So people who are prone to eating disorders, going on these diets can actually make those problems worse. And so that's one of the terrible consequences I talk about in the book that can occur from dieting and from being sort of believing some of these ideas about, well, these foods are villainous, these foods are poisonous, these foods are toxic, never eat them, and contributing to those kinds of unhealthy relationships with food.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Absolutely. And especially because there's also a lot of people who are saying, oh yeah, if you have immune disorders or something, then you should be on this kind of a diet, or if you've got brain fog or something, then oh yeah, go on a keto diet, or they try and put together the diet with some particular issue.
It would be nice if we could do that. It's an appealing idea, and it's precision. The idea, the term precision medicine refers to this idea of individualizing treatments, in this case diets, for specific people and specific conditions. And it's something that science is working on. And hopefully someday we'll be there where we can say, if you have this condition or you have this kind of issue with your weight, then this diet is best for you. But right now, honestly, the evidence doesn't allow us to do that. And when people do hear that a particular diet, and there may be a few exceptions certainly, but in general, a particular diet is good for a particular condition, in most cases, the evidence is not there. And that particularly when made by people who are pushing diet books or certain kinds of diets, they are jumping ahead of the evidence, or they're basing it on evidence in animals or in test tubes and not on really robust clinical data.
Yeah. Or just a few people. Right.
Now, again, there are exceptions.
Who feel better. right?
Right. And there are exceptions. We know that certain diets will help keep your cholesterol lower. We know that certain diets are better for diabetes. So again, I'm not saying it's across the
Right.
board, but
Yeah.
in general, as you point out, there are lots of claims with regard to diet and
Hmm.
conditions that are not
Yeah.
substantiated by the evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, exactly. Exactly. Um, yeah. And do you think it's something, well, I guess I was going to say it's something about human nature that likes to just have a all in one answer
No question. I think that's
to,
an excellent point. I think we're looking for simple answers, and it's understandable. It's human nature, and it's 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 human nature also to be able to point to a villain and say, okay, this problem, the problem is X, and if I can do away with X, then that will solve my problem.
yeah.
Um, as I point out, the flip side of that, and I have a chapter on heroes,
Uh-huh.
dietary heroes. So if you eat certain foods, that will also help weight loss. So whether it's apple cider vinegar or
Okay.
avocados or chili peppers. So it's a flip side of the same phenomenon, which is to say we
Oh.
look for simple answers in heroes as well as villains. But again, unfortunately, I wish it were the case that we could pinpoint specific heroes or villains and that be the key. But unfortunately, that's not the case. That weight loss, as I
Hmm.
said, is a very complex issue. It's a weight regulation is very complex, involves a number of factors, both biological, environmental, and to boil it down to either a villain or
Hmm.
a hero and say this is the answer um, doesn't cut it. Even though the impulse to believe that is certainly understandable.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And like we were saying a little bit, we touched on just a tad bit, is what works for me is not necessarily going to work well for you.
Exactly,
Right.
and that's so important for people
Yeah.
to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, I love eating avocados, but not everybody else necessarily either likes them or should be eating them. I mean, they do have a lot of fat in them. Well, it depends on what the rest of your diet looks like too, right? I mean, it's
Right.
just
And
yeah.
Susan, I think that's a very important point with regard to looking at other people, because this also, I think, contributes to what I consider to be perhaps the biggest problem of sort of diets and diet culture
Mm,
is that people, when the diets don't work for them, how they engage in self-blame and feeling that they're failures and
yep.
internalized stigma and all the rest. And
Yep.
so when you look at someone else and say, well, it worked for my friend, they lost 50, 30, 40, 50 pounds, and I'm not losing weight.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'm a failure. I didn't do it right.
Yeah.
I'm not diligent enough, whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I feel shame and self blame. Well, it may
Yeah.
have nothing to do with how hard you tried. It probably doesn't. It has to do with how your body is different from someone else's. And that gets to differences in genetics, differences in
Mm,
metabolism, differences, as you said, in perhaps in age, all kinds of other factors that we don't necessarily have control over that
mhm.
determine how effective a diet or an eating pattern is going to be for us in terms of
Right.
losing weight. And so I think
Yeah.
that's a really important point. And too often, not only do people get their dieting advice maybe from other people because something seemed to work for somebody else, they get it from celebrities. So they see these people with perfect bodies, perfectly sculpted bodies,
Mm,
people on
mm, mm.
Instagram showing pictures of their
Oh, yes.
bodies and their weight and so forth. And
Yeah.
what worked for
Yeah.
her, it will work for me. Well, not necessarily. But then
Yeah.
it's important for people to understand that so they don't engage in these kinds of destructive
Mhm.
thoughts, this destructive thought patterns about themselves when the diets don't work for them.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing that came to mind as you were talking about that is that we change as well, right? So what helped us to lose 20 pounds may not be totally what we need to maintain the 20 pounds off,
Right.
right? Sometimes, we stick with the same thing and then all of a sudden it either starts to go back or you start to not feel as well, or maybe you even lose too much weight.
Well, right. And that's an important point because, as you say, we change, specifically our metabolism changes. So as
Yeah,
we, for example,
right.
cut calories and lose weight, our metabolism actually slows down. So we have to eat fewer and fewer calories to maintain that weight. It's actually an evolutionary gift to keep us from wasting away in times of scarcity and famine. And thank goodness most of
Yeah.
us don't have to face that, but it creates a terrible problem for us when we are trying to lose weight in an environment of plenty, because we do have to keep eating fewer and fewer calories in order to maintain that weight, because our body is basically fighting us. It's trying to keep our weight, push our weight back up, keep us from wasting away. So we're essentially fighting biology as we lose weight. And that's something that often is lost when these diets are presented to people. It's, well, just keep on this diet and you'll keep losing weight. And it's not nearly that simple.
Yeah. And it's funny because I have never heard anybody say that. Not in any of the books, not when you see people on TV being interviewed or any of that kind of stuff.
Well, and one reason perhaps is it's a discouraging thing to hear. And I think nobody wants to hear you try as hard as you want, but your body's going to fight you and you're fighting biology. That's a very intimidating thing to fight. And so the good news is, though, it doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. It doesn't mean that you might as well give up and not try, because as I talk about in the book, there are ways of approaching weight maintenance and weight loss that can be successful, but you have to do it recognizing the facts about biology and how the body works.
Yeah. Well, and you talk a bit about exercise as well in the book.
And I said, right. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was going to say, just, why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how that plays into all of this?
Yeah, and this is another big myth, and I say this, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an avid exerciser. My last book was all about exercise. Everybody should exercise. I think it's the closest thing we have to a fountain of youth, because it can do everything from, reduce the risk of heart disease and cancer to help improve your mood, improve your sleep. I always say if there were a pill to help your brain, I always say if there were a pill that could do all the things exercise could do, we'd all be clamoring for it. It's truly remarkable what it can do. That said, one of the few things it cannot do very well, if at all, is to help you lose weight. And so what's ironic is that's the number one thing many, if not most people, look to exercise to do for them, to help them lose weight. And so often they're disappointed because it doesn't result in the weight loss they expected, and they give up. They said, well, this is futile. This isn't working, so I'm not going to exercise. And that's completely the wrong thing. We should exercise. Everybody should find a way to be physically active in a way that works for them, but to do it for the right reasons. And that is because it's going to help all these things I just mentioned, help them feel better, but not necessarily to help them lose weight. And the reason it doesn't help with weight loss is that, number one, it doesn't burn that many calories. So if you go for a walk, a brisk walk, that's going to be great for your health, for your heart, for your
heart,
well-being, and for a lot of things, but it's not necessarily going to burn that many calories. And so you're better off, not eating a cookie. That's going to actually be more effective than, going for a walk. So that's one reason. And then also, again, just as when we cut calories, our bodies respond, just as even if you exercise a lot and you burn 500 or 600 calories a day, which is a lot of vigorous exercise, which most of us are not willing or able to do. But let's say you can, again, your body's going to respond. Your body's going to adapt in certain ways to slow your metabolism down, to increase your appetite, and even make you perhaps move around less in ways you're not aware of when you're not exercising, just to conserve energy. So the point is that even when you do that, your body's going to react. And so you may not end up losing as much weight as you would expect from that kind of calorie burning, or any at all. So again, it's analogous to cutting calories, and that the body's going to respond and make it more and more difficult to lose weight that way. So I think that, we hear often the secret to weight loss is eat less, move more, sometimes called ELM, ELMM. And I like to say that for many people, Elm Street is a dead end, because they try so hard, they cut calories, they exercise, they find it doesn't work, or they say, you know what, I ate extra food, I indulged more than I wanted to last night or over the weekend or over the holidays, so I'm going to exercise more. I'm going to
go to the gym.
And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't that doesn't burn enough calories typically to make the difference, and so people become very frustrated. And so again, I think it's important to understand the realities of our biology so that people can take actions accordingly and not just keep banging their head against the wall when what they're told doesn't work.
Yeah. So what kind of thought that just came to mind is, as people are losing weight or have lost weight, is that something that they need to that they need to think about and really look at? I know you talk about maintenance in the book,
Right.
but particularly, we were talking earlier about people as they're getting older. Does the maintenance in the book kind of apply to that as well, even if you aren't specifically saying
Yes.
that in the book?
Yeah, and one thing that's relevant to the conversation we're just having about exercise, and this
Yeah.
is an important point, is that while exercise cannot necessarily help you lose weight or is not an effective way to lose weight, it's very important when it comes to maintenance. That is, not gaining weight, preventing weight gain in the first place, or preventing the regain of weight that you've lost. So the studies do show that exercise is very important for that,
Oh,
and
okay.
an important part of maintenance. And so there's study after study shows that people who exercise regularly, and there's the studies vary in terms of how much is necessary, but generally the amount that's recommended for good health, that is to say, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week of aerobic activity. Again, you can break it up into small chunks, and a couple of days a week of resistance training. And that doesn't have to mean going to the gym. You can use body weight, you can use cans at home, you can use
Uh-huh.
bands, any number
Yeah.
of ways. But that kind of regimen is crucial when it comes to actually preventing weight gain or maintaining weight loss. And so that's really important to keep in mind, so that, again, to understand how exercise can be beneficial and what it can do for you versus what it's not so good at doing. And then beyond that, there are all kinds of other steps people can take, important things people can do in order to maintain their weight. Because, again, as we've said, most diets can help you initially lose weight. The real challenge is, how do you keep that weight off? That's because something very, very kind of disappointingly, something like 97% of people report regaining lost weight. So the question is, are you going to regain most of it or all of it, or can you minimize the amount of regain? And again,
Right.
doing certain things to minimize that weight regain is what's crucial.
Do people have a tendency to lose more than they actually need to lose?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I have a whole chapter about this in terms of figuring out what your ideal weight is. What should you weigh?
Uh-huh.
Because we hear about BMI, the body
Yeah.
mass index. That's the standard yardstick for determining whether somebody is at the right
Uh-huh.
weight, whether they weigh too much, whether they weigh too little.
Right.
And I talk about the shortcomings. There are considerable shortcomings with BMI. So sometimes people may be told, you are obese, you need to lose weight, and people try to lose weight when in fact they're not obese. They have a lot of muscle,
Okay. Uh-huh.
or their weight is higher because of bone and muscle, which is not
Okay.
reflected in BMI. On the other hand, people may be told your weight is fine, and according to BMI, and in fact, they may have excess body fat. So the problem is that it's hard to know what your quote ideal weight should be. One way of determining it is using waist circumference. Some doctors use that
Okay.
as an alternative to BMI,
Mm-hmm.
so that that can be a better indicator of your metabolic health. But the way that I like to look at it is, I think a good way to think about what a good weight is for you is, at what weight are you healthy, meaning you're
Mm-hmm.
metabolically healthy, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your blood
Okay.
sugar, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And at what weight is sustainable for you? At what weight can
Yeah.
you be on a healthy diet and sustain that weight without going up and down, without yo-yoing, and
Mm-hmm.
continue that weight for, or more or less, for the
Yeah.
long term? And I think that's, not a weight you necessarily got off a BMI chart, not a weight that you weighed 20 or 30 years ago, not
Yeah.
necessarily your lowest weight ever, not a weight of somebody you saw on Instagram or that your friend said they got to, not a weight you
Okay.
sort of pulled out of the air, but a weight that's
Yeah.
healthy and sustainable for you. I mean, I
Right.
think that's an important thing to consider as you're looking at, what should I weigh? And sometimes you're
Yeah.
right. People will shoot for weights that are too low or not sustainable for them, and their bodies fight back. And so
Mm.
it's involves a lot of trial and error. Everybody's different, obviously, but finding that sweet spot, that weight that's healthy for you, that you can sustain over the long term, is really what's important.
Okay. Okay. And then um when we were talking about, people as they start aging, right?
Right.
Things change. Um, are there particular things in their diets that they should be looking at maybe changing up, maybe not eating as much carbohydrates, maybe eating more protein, or maybe not, maybe it's the other way around. But, I mean, I realize all of this is very individual,
Right.
right? I mean, bottom line. But are there some kinds of things that just seem to pop out when you look at, as people, 50s, 60s, 70s? I mean, people are living a whole lot longer these days. It's so normal almost to see 80-year-olds running around,
My mother is one of them. Yes.
Well, there you go. I mean,
Yeah.
my mother was in her mid-90s when she passed. And that was, I don't know, 10, no, not 2014, about 8 years ago, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer to that is that, again, science isn't at a place where we can pinpoint and say people in their 60s, 70s, 80s should eat more. But we know some general things. We know, for example, getting more protein is important. Just because we lose muscle mass as we get older. So getting more protein is important.
And trying to do exercises.
Absolutely.
With
doing
weight
resistance
bearing
exercises. Absolutely. Weight bearing, that is crucial because we lose muscle mass. And so maintaining that muscle mass is important for two reasons. Number one is that it keeps people from getting feeble. They're able to sort of continue doing everyday activities more easily by having more muscle mass.
Yep.
And also muscle burns more calories than fat does. Okay. So the more muscle we have, the more calories we can burn. And that's one of the reasons as people get older, they tend to put on weight sometimes because they have less muscle mass, and that burns fewer calories than fat does. So the more you can maintain muscle mass, the better. And the two ways you do that are through, number one, through resistance training, as you say, and number two, through eating more protein. And the other advantage of protein is it can help fill you up. So many people find that eating more protein leaves them less hungry, so they're less likely to overeat. Yeah. And so that's another advantage of getting. And so I think one thing that many people recommend is just getting some protein at every meal. Instead of getting all your protein at dinner, make sure you get protein throughout the day, so that
maybe
you stay
different kinds,
full more.
different kinds of
different
protein
kinds
as
of
well.
Protein. So not just if you're if you're omnivore, you can eat animal protein as well as vegetables and beans, and there are a number of different sources that aren't necessarily. If you eat dairy, you can eat dairy as well.
Okay.
Protein from dairy.
Yeah.
So you can get protein from a number of different sources.
And is that, if protein's good for your brain too, I think, isn't it?
I think there's certainly getting enough is important. A deficiency can be harmful. But I think also we should be, I think it's important to point out, we shouldn't be afraid of carbs either. Again, some of these diets that we talked about have made people afraid of carbs and not eating carbs. But, there are, quote, good carbs and bad carbs. And there's the kind of carbs that aren't good are the refined grains and highly processed foods that we see from things like chips and crackers and soda and sweets and so forth. And I think we want to keep those, white bread, exactly. We want to keep those to a minimum, but we want to emphasize complex carbohydrates, whole grains, beans, brown rice, complex carbohydrates that really are the fuel for our bodies. Glucose is what fuels our bodies and gives us energy. And so we want to make sure we have enough energy. So I think it's important to not be afraid of carbs, but understand that it's important to get the right carbs. And I think that's key. Certainly as we get older, to make sure that we focus on that. Something else that's important is getting enough water. I think in general, it's a myth that when you hear people that you need 8 glasses, everyone needs 8 glasses of water a day. But it is true, as we get older, our sense of thirst in some people is not as acute. And so maybe they can't necessarily rely as easily on whether they're thirsty or not to know whether they need to drink. So sometimes just making sure that you're hydrated as you get older, getting enough water is important, not only for your health, but again, it can be helpful for your weight, because there are studies that show that when you drink more water within 30 minutes or so of a meal, it can fill you up and you eat less. So drinking right before a meal is a trick that can work for some people, helping them to reduce their calorie intake.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that and I can identify with that. I have noticed that I drink less water. I'm not as thirsty. I mean, I've got my cup of coffee here, but
and that counts, by the way. People sometimes don't count coffee, but it does count as your fluid intake.
I know. Isn't that exciting? but I do have to remember, I literally have to remember, I mean, I drink it to take my vitamins and all that kind of stuff, but I really have to remember to keep some water on my desk and keep drinking it. I
Yeah,
mean,
I do the same thing because
yeah,
I'm the same way. As I won't feel thirsty, and then I realize I've gone for hours without drinking. And again,
yes,
that becomes more and more of an issue as people get older. Uh,
yes, yes,
so that's
yes,
why keeping water nearby at all times
yeah,
is a good idea.
yeah. Well, and it affects our bodies as well, right? Because the water helps to get the toxins out and all of that. And that's how we all end up with bladder infections and
And it has,
stuff
and
like that.
interestingly, it has some cosmetic effect potentially too, because when people are hydrated, it can make their skin look more wrinkled. So,
That's my
drinking extra water
problem.
won't extra water won't make your wrinkles go away, but having too little water can bring out more wrinkles.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Is that why my lips are always chapped? They always feel dry. I think it's the coffee. But anyways, I digress. Yeah, that's really interesting. And there are so many other things as well. It doesn't necessarily, like you say, coffee, juice, although you have to be careful of the sugar, right?
Right,
But there's
right.
certain kinds. And of course, if coffee is, then tea is. But there's so many different ways eating fruit.
Yes, you get water from foods, you get water from
Yeah,
fruit, you get water from vegetables. So yes,
yeah,
absolutely, that's a source as
yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, people, because I know some people are. I know my mother used to always, oh, I don't like drinking water. It's like, well, there's a hell of a lot of other things out there you can eat or drink. You
Right,
know.
and you can add if you add flavors, or you can add fruit to the water. A lot of people do that. Just add a little orange
Yeah.
or lemon or other fruits into your water and
Uh
give
huh.
it kind of a little bit of a sweetness, and then people
Yep.
that makes it more palatable.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So any other pointers for people as they get older to be on the lookout for that they should
Well, one
be
one
trying to.
thing that I think is one of the things that I recommend and I talk about in the book is keeping a food diary. And
Mm,
again, this is something that people don't necessarily have to do all the time, every day throughout their lives. But sometimes if people find that they are not reaching their goals, whatever they may be in terms of their weight, I think a lot of people find it very helpful just to keep a food diary. You don't have to do it indefinitely, as I said, but do it for a few weeks. And what keeping a food diary entails is writing down every day after every time you eat, and you can put it in your phone and then transfer it over to a notebook or put it in your computer, or there
mhm,
are apps that let you do this. But just writing down not only what you ate, but how much you ate, where you were when you ate, who you were with when you ate, were you by yourself, were you with other people, how you were
oh,
feeling when you ate, how you felt after you ate. So keeping track of not only what you eat, but your emotions and the
mhm,
environment and so forth. And then writing it down honestly. And it's important to do it as you're eating, because, I can't remember what I ate last week, or this morning, much less last week.
right.
So it's important
Yeah.
to do it as you're going along. But then the whole point is that you get a record of your eating patterns, of what was happening. And then you can look
Mhm,
at it and say, okay, I realize that when I'm alone, I eat more or I eat less. Or I realize that when I was feeling down, I ate more junk food. Or I realize that when I'm in a hurry, I tend to scarf down food in the car and I eat less healthy foods. And on those
yeah.
days, I don't get foods that are filling. Whatever it is, I think
Mhm,
it can be very helpful. And so sometimes as we get older, our lifestyles may change because
mhm,
of retirement, because of other changes in life,
mhm.
emotional changes, things we're dealing with, whatever the case may be. And those can affect our eating patterns. And so I think it's important if we really, and sometimes we're not even aware of that. And so the point of keeping a food diary is to say, okay, I'm going to keep a record here so I know what I'm doing, which I may not otherwise be aware of. So then I can take actions to say, okay, I realize that when I'm feeling lonely or I'm feeling down, I start to eat more junk food. And I know that
Okay.
instead I can
Yeah.
have a plan that when that happens, I'm going to call a friend, or I'm going to listen to
Okay.
music, or I'm going to go for a walk or something
Uh-huh.
like that, so that you have not only a record of what's happening, but then you can develop a plan to deal with some of the patterns you see that may be
Okay.
contributing to weight gain or issues with your weight.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And just to interject, I mean, something else as well is when you feel like you want to have a piece of cake or something like that, take a piece of fruit.
Right.
See if that doesn't satisfy. My husband and I have gotten into the habit of, cutting up an apple, and we just share an apple after dinner. That's dessert. That you get that sweetness, but you don't have to get all that other sugar and white flour and other things that are in.
Right. And that's
cake or pie.
exactly. And finding alternatives that work for you. And that for everybody, it's going to be different. What works for me is a piece of dark chocolate. I love dark chocolate.
There you go.
And
We have some of that
very
around
low.
here
I'll
too.
eat 1 or 2 squares of dark chocolate, which is very low in sugar. And
Yes.
that satisfies my sweet tooth. Now, there's plenty of other people who hate dark chocolate, including my family members. They can't believe I like it.
And they don't think it's sweet, right?
Right. But it works for me. And so what works for me, obviously, is not going to work for somebody else. But that's the key, is finding the thing that's going to work for you. That's
right. Absolutely. 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 So talking about sugar and sweet, give us the 2-minute rundown on sugar and the different kinds of sugar, and, what to kind of limit a little bit, shall we say?
Right. Well, there's all kinds of discussion. And one of the things I talk about is, sugar is one of the villains, where people say sugar is the number one cause. There are people who say, prominent doctors who'll say that sugar is the number one villain. And again, the evidence doesn't support that sugar is the number one villain when it comes to weight. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that eating a lot of sugar is good, because most of us in American culture eat too much sugar, because sugar is not only in the foods that we think of as sugary, it's put in all kinds of other foods, from spaghetti sauce to bread, that we don't even know we're getting it. So we eat a lot of sugar. So I think it's good to be aware of sugar. So when you think about looking at foods, look at the nutrition label and look at how much sugar it has, and take that in consideration when you're thinking about how much sugar to eat. Now, as for what form is worse, we hear a lot about high fructose corn syrup is worse than regular sugar, honey's better. But the truth is that to the body, sugar is sugar. Generally, the body processes sugars the same way. So just because it has honey, just because it has brown molasses, just because it has some healthy sounding form of sugar, doesn't mean it's better for you. And this is a marketing trick that a lot of foods will, just a touch of honey, which it can be misleading on 2 levels. What is a touch? A touch can be a lot. There's no scientific or legal term. Yeah, what a touch is. It could be 10 or 12 grams of sugar. And then the honey is not necessarily more helpful than table sugar, sucrose. So I think it's important not to be tricked by these marketing terms, these health halos that are applied to foods to make us think it's a healthier form of sugar. So I think the point is that we should be aware of sugar as one component that contribute to weight gain. Sugar is not by itself poisonous or toxic, but it is something that we want to try to, we ought to eat less than we're eating, and to be aware of it, just as we need to be aware of other components of food.
Yeah. Well, and sugar, like a lot of things, anything in large amounts typically is not real good for you.
Correct.
Right. I mean, just if for no other reason than the fact that it's pushing out all the other good things that you should be eating.
Right. And again, as I said, we have a lot of sugar in our diet just because of the way it's added to so many products.
Well,
so a lot more than we are aware that we're getting often.
Yeah. That's what we always look at on the label, is how much added sugar.
Yes, added sugar. That's the important thing.
Right. As opposed
in general, but I should add, you mentioned fruit juice earlier. Most foods that have naturally occurring sugars are thought to be more helpful than foods with sugar that's added. But there's some exceptions, fruit juice being one exception. Fruit juice does have lots of vitamins and minerals, but it also has lots of sugar. Now, it's naturally occurring sugar, but studies do show that this sugar drinking a lot of fruit juice can contribute not only to weight gain, but also diabetes, as opposed to eating whole fruit, which has the opposite effect.
The fiber.
That's exactly because it slows down the absorption of that sugar. Now, that's not to say you should never drink fruit juice. I like fruit juice, but I just keep my quantities limited. I don't drink a lot. But I love orange juice, so I just don't. I keep it very limited to a few ounces. So again, it's not a matter of this food's off limits or it's toxic, never touch it. If you like it, it's okay to drink fruit juice. Just don't assume that you can drink as much as you want and it won't have any consequences.
Yeah. Well, and again, look at how much added sugar is put in. And
Yeah.
if it's just from fruit and nothing else, it
Yeah,
should
if
be
it's just from
sweet enough.
fruit, you still right. You still need to watch it for fruit juice, but I think you're right.
Uh-huh.
Particularly if it's added sugar, these sort of fruit beverages that add sugar, those are certainly much even more of a problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, I guess we could probably, between you and I, we could probably go on for hours, but we should probably try and wrap it up a little bit here. So, okay, so here's Robert's book. Everybody can see Supersized Lies. It's very readable. I have been reading it, and I like all the little things about calling out what's a myth and what isn't, and it's been very educational. And I've been looking at all of this and reading about all of this for 30 years. So I still definitely found things that were new to me. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. That's nice to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. And like I say, it's very readable. The way it's organized is also very readable. You don't go, oh my God, what is he talking about? Right.
Well, you'll see, readers that are interested will see I have over 300 citations, and I've combed through thousands of studies, but I've really tried to make it accessible. So to try to explain the science in a way that anybody without a scientific background can understand. But if you are interested in the science and reading more about the studies, they're in the back. I refer to lots of studies, and you can go look them up if you'd like, if you're so inclined.
Yeah, I may. Okay, and I will put a link to Amazon to the book in the show notes if anyone is interested in going out and grabbing their own copy. And okay, so is there any just kind of wrap up thing that you'd like to say to kind of the very 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 short version of the book?
I would just say that there are lots of things we hear that are not true, and it can be very discouraging. But at the same time, my message is don't be discouraged. There are things that you can do that can be effective. And so it's a matter of following those steps, and I outline them in the book, and not getting discouraged and not becoming cynical and throwing up your hands and saying, well, nothing works, everyone's lying to me, but knowing there are things you can do to not only maintain a weight that's you're satisfied with, but also be healthy. And again, in the end, it's being healthy that matters the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And to create a healthy diet. And I don't mean that in cutting calories diet. I mean, just what you eat. That's going to work for you, because
Exactly.
we all have things that we like to eat and things that we don't like to eat. Right? I mean, you talk about beans, and that's great. My husband loves beans. I couldn't get down a thing of beans, regular beans, if somebody paid me. Well, maybe if somebody paid me, but not voluntarily. So, I mean, we all have likes and dislikes.
Right. Absolutely.
That's being human.
Yep.
Right. So find what works for you and go with it.
Yep. Absolutely. And I hope that people can, if they look at my book, they can find, I try to lay out some guidelines to help them do that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for writing it.
Well, thank you, Susan. And thank you for having me. It's been fun talking to you.
Yes. Thank you. And I will say that neither of us are doctors. This is not to be seen as medical advice, although I guess technically you're a Ph.D. doctor, but it's not an MD. If you do have an extreme problem, you might want to get your doctor involved when you're going through the book to get their input in helping you develop the right diet that's going to be right for you and your health. And so with that, I will say goodbye. Thank you again to Robert, and I will see all of you next week.